All right, welcome everyone to our Rethinking Work Series. This is the last session of this year, but we are very busy building the agenda for the next semester, so stay tuned. But we are delighted to have Ben Zweig with us today. Ben is the founder and CEO of Revelio Labs, a workforce intelligence company. And what Ben does is it couldn't be more relevant to our time. And this is also a perfect timing to have Ben with us because he's about to release his new book, Jobs Architecture, that's going to be published in January. And we are the lucky ones to get the preview of some of the very critical topics that Ben is going to share with the world. But we're here to hear his first and, most importantly, ask him questions. And for the questions, just a reminder to everyone, I would like you to put the questions in the Q&A folder tab on your screens. But first, in the chat, let us know where you're calling from so that we know the diverse audience that we usually gather for our sessions. But Ben, welcome, and let us get started.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, as you know, we have a very special connection. Ben is, in addition to being the founder, the CEO, a very prominent these days, covered by the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other media outlets, a very current participant in the big discussions around jobs of the future or jobs of today. Ben is also an adjunct instructor at Stern, as well as, Ben benefited from the support of our Center for Entrepreneurship in developing his company from just an idea to now employing about 70 economists, data scientists, etc. And Ben can tell us a little bit about Revelio Labs because he actually happens to be also hiring as the business is growing. This is the one of those opportunities, I think, Ben, that you are tapping the market for. Tell us a little bit about your firm and the idea behind, putting out a book named Jobs Architecture, titled.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also want to thank Anna for not just for hosting and being part of NYU, which has been helpful, but also for personally being helpful and an early mentor and advocate and ally. Just as I was getting into the people analytics world. So thank you. Okay, so yeah, I'll go through the background of myself, of Revelio Labs, of the book Job Architecture, and where I think we're all going with that. And I also just want to say, please feel free to hop in with questions, comments. This can be interactive. But I'll kind of plow ahead. But if you wanna jump in, feel free to jump in. So a little bit about my background and how I kind of got to this is that I started off really as an economist. I was doing a PhD in economics and that's a little bit different from what the typical background of someone who goes into people analytics. But I think it's relevant to what we're going to discuss today. So I studied economics and I still have a foot in academia. Like Anna said, I teach the future of work at NYU, which is wonderful, wonderful course, and it's a lot of fun. So still kind of stay in academia a little bit. I'm involved in some research, but I really started my career in finance. So prior to doing a PhD in economics, I'd done a master's in risk management, which is basically finance, and had worked at a hedge fund. This was an emerging markets hedge fund. And I was really, struck by how sophisticated things were, within finance. Finance is a very mature discipline. It's been around for a long time. It's been scientific. It's been rigorous for a long time. And that was interesting. And then after being in finance, I realized I don't have the stomach to to stay in finance. You have to be pretty zen about how your portfolio is doing. And I would, wake up nervous every morning. So I realized like finance isn't for me. But then went to the corporate world and figured, I should see how goods and services get made in the real economy and went to IBM, which was so interesting because IBM was really advanced in people analytics at the time. I think it still is. Um, but still, despite being quite advanced relative to other companies, it was way behind where finance was. So going into the world of people analytics, and I eventually ran a workforce analytics team there, um, through a group called the Chief Analytics Office, which is like an internal data science consulting team. Really found that there were a lot of foundational pieces to analyzing human capital data, analyzing employment data that really weren't there. So so started seeing big differences between where finance was and where labor was. So that's a little bit of the framing, and I want to just like take a second, take a step back and give you a little bit of economics 101. So just because, I can't help it. So this is what you do when you get an economist in the room. Um, but yeah, so for those of you who have taken economics, this might be familiar. There are essentially two major factors of production in the economy. There's labor and there's capital. And for those of you who have taken an economics class, I'm sure you've seen a production function. The most famous one is the Cobb-Douglas production function, which aims to decompose the economic output into the factors of production. And what you get when you do this decomposition pretty consistently is that you get about 1/3 of economic output being attributable to capital and 2/3 of economic output being attributable to labor. So essentially, labor markets are twice as big as capital markets, twice as important as capital markets. And that kind of resonates with our life also. I mean, about 2/3 of income is generated from labor. And labor markets are how everyone in the labor market spends their time. We all engage in labor market activities, whether it's investing in our education or working for a company or starting our own firm. These are all we're all part of labor markets, and capital markets are also tremendously important, but not as important as labor markets. But what I think is kind of confusing is that we look at finance, which is the science of allocating capital, and there's a whole sector of finance. And there really is no sector of the economy which is designated to allocate labor efficiently. I mean, I think we kind of do it as analytical HR, but we're very small relative to how big and influential finance is. Finance is like 19% of the economy. I don't know what HR analytics is, but certainly not close to that. So there's a big disconnect, and as a society, we allocate capital pretty efficiently. Capital can pretty much find it, the most efficient allocation, but labor not so much. People often end up in jobs they don't like, that's not a good fit for them. Companies are kind of, flying blind when it comes to how to hire, how to retain employees, how to think about layoffs, and just do workforce planning generally. It feels very reactive, and I think we've all experienced that general vibe that we're not doing this super rigorously. So I think there's some major differences between capital markets and labor markets, but one major difference that I think needs to be called out is that capital markets benefit from a lot of infrastructure around categorizing data. So when we think about financial data, companies have financial statements. They have very rigorous guidelines for how financial data is reported. And there are millions and millions of people in the world whose job it is to categorize financial market data. We've all heard of them. They are called accountants. That is why accountants exist. And their job is to categorize financial market data. And there are no accountants for labor market data. So the data that we deal with, related to employment is not categorized in a way that is standardized across organizations. So, maybe, I'd love to see a world where there's, armies of millions of people whose job it is to categorize employment data, but that really doesn't exist. There is no accounting department for employment data. And that's just not an occupation that exists. So, we could think, all right, well, that's a benefit, and financial markets benefit from that cleanliness of the data, and labor markets don't. And there you go. We can't be as efficient. And that's one read on it. But I think the reality has changed around 2015, 2016. And what happened around that time was the first iteration of large language models started getting introduced. So the earliest large language model was called word to vec, and then there were further improvements on that. Doc to vec was a way to represent a set of words, a paragraph of words, and understand the semantic similarity between paragraphs. So you could look at I think some of the examples they used are Wikipedia pages. You can look at the Wikipedia page for um, you know, New York University. And then you could look at the, Wikipedia page for Columbia University. And those Wikipedia pages would have similar distributions of words. And you could say, all right, those things are pretty similar. But if you look at New York University, the Wikipedia page for New York University, compared to the Wikipedia page for ice cream, they would be very different. They would have a very different distribution of words. So that was the purpose of Doc2Vec. And that was a very powerful technology. And so I had started using these around 2016, 2017, and then started getting this idea that we could represent jobs in the same way. So there's a lot of data um, that exists in the public domain related to employment. So um, of course, every company has their HR database. They've got, and in that HR database, they've got someone's job title, their start date, their end date, their name, et cetera. And a lot of that information is actually mirrored in the public domain. So, just like you exist in an HR database, that data also exists on your resume, on your LinkedIn profile. Maybe some of that information exists in job postings. So there's a lot of data that's just out there in the public domain that can be used to kind of reconstruct what we have in internal HR databases. The problem is it's not standard. Beginnings of thinking about job architecture in a more scientific way is that we can think of jobs as bundles of activities. A job is simply a bundle of tasks, bundle of activities. I'm kind of using those interchangeably. And there's a lot of good data about activities that exist in the public domain. So one major source of data is the bullet points on resumes. You got a resume. It says your job title, your start date, your end date, your company name, and then what you did. The bullet points are your accomplishments. What your responsibilities were at in that role. There's billions of these. There's billions of positions. They all have a little paragraph. I mean, most of them have a little paragraph related to it. And we could think of that paragraph like a Wikipedia page, a document that can be represented mathematically using large language models. Another source of data is job postings. A job listing has a bunch of different sections. It's got, qualifications, skills, company information, and it's got responsibilities. So this responsibilities section is also an outline of what you're expected to do in that job. And that's where we can find similarities between jobs. So one very simple example is if you look at all the text related to everyone in the world who has the title lawyer, that's going to have some distribution of words. If you look at all the text related to everyone in the world who has the title attorney, that's going to have some distribution of words. And those are going to be very close. So if you look at the mathematical representation of lawyer, mathematical representation of attorney, those are going to be basically the same. They're going to be so close that we can then cluster them together. And clustering is a technology that's been around for a long time. So, as long as we can represent things mathematically, then we can cluster them and then we can create categories. So then we can find out that things like lawyer and attorney are really kind of in the same occupation, let's say. And then there's other examples that are trickier. You might have a product manager at Facebook and you have a product manager at JP Morgan. And those things might be completely different jobs. One might be more like an engineering lead, another might be more like a client success manager, but we can know that based on the words that people use, the sentences they use to describe what they do in that job, from the responsibilities section of job postings, the bullet points on resumes. And then we can find out, what jobs belong together. We can create categories. And this is something that doesn't require armies of accountants. Technology by itself, large language models by itself, is really good at categorizing information in the world. So we can really leapfrog this whole, all this history of, you know, accountants, that there's hundreds of years of history. There's whole organizations, there's lots of regulation around how to properly account for things. And we don't need that. We can skip it because now we have large language models and they're very good at that. Better than accountants, I would say. So that's really a gift. And that really brings us to this modern era where we can categorize information well. And there's something even kind of more exciting about that we can categorize within organizations. Every company needs to categorize their employees, and we can categorize between organizations. We can make sure that when we are comparing companies, we are making an apples to apples comparison. We are making sure that the categories are consistent across organizations so that we can understand how different companies are differentiated, what they have more of, what they have less of, what they're better at, what they're worse at. So this is all possible now, in ways that wasn't possible, even 10 years ago. So this is all very new and it's very exciting. And that's what prompted this idea of writing job architecture, to go through, how this can be done. And so let me just kind of go through the structure of the book. And I have a copy right here. There's one on the mantle, but I got two. So, it's coming out January 13th. This is an advanced review copy. But really, really it's split into three sections. So one section is about sort of the theory of jobs, taxonomies, how we should think about jobs, occupations, skills, work activities, tasks. These are all, even seniority levels, industries. There's a lot of confusion in the space about how we should even think about, what jobs are, why they exist. So it's a little bit of like the philosophy around, how jobs get organized. So that's kind of section one, and how we should think about this, and a little bit more information about, like, how we should formalize our understanding of these things. The second section is really about how to build taxonomies, how to maintain them, how to version them, and hopefully showing people that this isn't so complicated. And the goal in that section, this is like a little bit tongue in cheek, but barely. The goal is that organizations should not be hiring consulting firms and paying millions of dollars to do a job architecture project. It's just not necessary anymore. We have technology that can do a better job. And then you don't have to go back and revisit it every 2 or 3 years. So yeah, I think that's just, a little bit of like how to actually do this yourself or cheaply. Then there's the third section, which is really like who benefits. What does this mean for employees, for companies, for investors, for governments? So what is the future when we have labor markets well categorized, like capital markets are? Can we be as sophisticated as capital markets? And spoiler alert, I think the answer is yes. Um, that's really the gist of it. A little bit about Revelio Labs, which is the the company I started that Anna spoke about, we're really in the business of categorizing information. We are collecting all that public information and categorizing it, curating it, cleaning it, and delivering that information, developing insights from that data so that we can compare organizations, do benchmarking, um, planning, any sort of analytics, easily. And that really relies on good and sophisticated job architecture. So it's really, I think, developing these taxonomies is really what I've been doing actively for, more than a decade at this point. So yeah, it's a real, it's a real honor to kind of be putting the thoughts out there and trying to help others who are struggling with the same things.
Yes, this is a fascinating journey. And again, it started out in the sort of the margins of the conversation when, people analytics was just emerging, even as a category, to say nothing of a whole segment of HR. And now it is becoming front and center, and not so much analytics as pure data, but really a more comprehensive view of labor markets. And I think, yeah, I want to just you to comment on how you were sort of thrust through circumstances into the mainstream discussion as BLS was taken offline due to, different, geopolitical trends that we had. And you stepped in with the press release saying, we actually need to continue to evolve what we see as labor data and where we get the data, labor data from, and how there could be other sources of data that are currently missing from, the main accounting for what labor markets represent. Could you give us a little bit of an insight into that particular situation and where you see the opportunity in the challenge that we were presented with?
Yeah, it was a wild few months. Yeah, basically, a few months ago, the president had fired Erica McIntyre, who was the commissioner of the BLS, and basically, had posited this idea that there was some politicization at the BLS, and then of course by firing her, it became even more politicized. So I think as economists, we were freaking out. All economists really in the world were very nervous about this. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics is such an important institution in producing, government data that's used by so many people in the world. So we were nervous, and as Revelio, we're labor economists, but we're really, here's a little bit of nuance. I mean, there's labor economists who are microeconomists and there's labor economists who are macroeconomists. And we are microeconomists. We are analyzing companies, we're analyzing firms. We really are in the business of saying like, oh, here's some company that has a spike in the attrition rate of salespeople. Um, you know, maybe you should use this for competitive intelligence or something like that. It was really very micro level statistics. But of course, we can aggregate to an economy and see the macro statistics. So we thought, we always knew that we could do this, but the BLS was doing a very good job and we didn't really think it was so necessary. There's also some complications. It's not just as simple as aggregating to the country and seeing what happens, because so much of what we do is adjusting for biases in the underlying data. So, there's sampling bias, which we've always addressed. That wasn't so much an issue, but there's also lags in reporting. So, when someone changes their job, maybe they update that right away. Maybe that takes them 3 months or a year, however long it takes. And we try to, predict what will be retroactively revealed once that, you know, in the absence of that information loss, in the absence of that lag. And the way the lag and how people report a transition between companies is a lot different than how people report a transition, in and out of the economy at large. So we had to adopt our models and make sure that, there was a lot of work to do, but we just felt like, the world may be without labor market statistics, without macroeconomic statistics, and that is very scary. Or we may not be able to trust them. So we made the decision to come out with our own labor statistics. We call it Revelio Public Labor Statistics, RPLS, and and we said, hey, this is something that we are going to put out as a public service. We're not making money from it. We don't really do macroeconomic stuff. I mean, now we do, of course, but this was new for us, and we were able to put it out because we felt like there was a void. Timing couldn't have been better because the next month the government shut down, and in the government shutdown, nobody got labor statistics, so we were kind of the only game in town, and then it became very critical to have this information. So had we not made the call to do this, you know consumers of macroeconomic data would have been at more of a loss. It was very interesting getting into macro statistics. I gotten in touch with all the former commissioners of the BLS, and I think what I had sort of gathered was that there's a lot of territorialism within the government and what they produce, and the idea of having private sector alternatives was uncomfortable. Um, but I think we feel very excited that we're doing this because there are some things that the government just can't do. One is just, have firm level data, so we can say, oh, employment increased in this sector by 20,000 jobs. Like, is that all driven by one company? They don't really know, but we would be able to know that. There's also the ability to go global. In the US, government statistics are, kind of getting less reliable over time, but they're even worse in the UK. They're not great in in other parts of the world. So I think we could actually extend this globally. So that's kind of an exciting prospect, and something that we're also kind of working on. So that's to come, yet to come. Um, I see Bob Pulver asked a question. So debate about prediction markets. So we consider incorporating those into labor market forecasts to get more real-time info. We haven't. Yeah, we haven't really because I think we want to be kind of an independent source. And to the extent that prediction markets can be informative for the health of the labor economy, of the labor market could be, or just the general economy could be useful. And it's probably useful for them to remain independent. So if we think about labor statistics right now, it's we get BLS data, we get Revelio data, and there's also ADP data. So that they produce payroll statistics, and they've all got strengths and weaknesses. And so the BLS surveys employers. They get their data from surveys. ADP gets it from payroll systems, and we get it from the digital footprint that's on the internet. And those are all, the data generating process is completely independent in all of those. They really have nothing to do with each other. So one thought, I think as a statistician, I like to think, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we got, the raw surveys and we got the payroll systems and we got the digital data that we get, and what if we unified them and made some like master model? And I get excited about that, but then I think, just taking a straight average of those three is probably not that much worse. So because they're roughly independent. So I think to the extent that you could use independently derived sources to construct some ensemble prediction, it's probably a really good idea. I think prediction markets are tricky because they're already an ensemble. So maybe prediction markets can gather information from a few independent sources. So maybe they can be the ultimate arbiter of what's right.
Yeah, there are a couple of really good questions here from Sean here. given the lag in ONET surveys, do you think the future is replacing standard occupational classification codes entirely with dynamic taxonomies like Revelio, or just layering real-time data on top of the old ONET framework?
Yeah, great question. So I think, I mean, yeah, maybe this is too bold of a take, but I think ONET is close to useless right now. It's very widely used because it is the only standard taxonomy, but there are a few problems with ONET. One is that it doesn't update in real time, and the labor market is changing much faster than ONET can update. So, I was a data scientist in 2012, and I think the title data scientist came out and own it, I think 2020. So that's like 8 years later, which is insane. Like that was already a very core part of the economy, way before Onet caught up with it. And in the meantime, there's like, I think 6 types of fishermen in Onet. So, to not have data scientists, but to be so deep into areas that are so economically insignificant is, kind of ridiculous. There's another problem, which I think is a deeper problem. And that is that and I think the evidence we have of this problem that I'll explain is that there are approximately 0 organizations that use ONET for their internal taxonomy. Companies don't do it, and they can't do it. And the reason why is because it's not specific in ways that companies need it to be specific. And so it's broad where it should be specific, and it's specific where it should be broad. And that is just even more true when you get down to the organizational needs. So the way I think we should think about taxonomies is that the level of specificity, the level of granularity should be based on um, the organization's coverage within a certain part of the space. So yeah, let me just get really really nerdy on you for a bit. So let's say we think about a taxonomy as a tree. So we have a tree-based structure where you have let's take occupations for example, where you have like granular occupations. Let's say you have like 10,000 or 50,000 like specific, you know, um, very very detailed jobs. And then you get broader, you aggregate that up and maybe you have 1,000 and those are like, you call them like occupations. Then maybe you aggregate even more, you get 100, and then you get 20, and then you get 10 or whatever. And you call that a job family or something. And you get these broader and broader views of how you should group occupations together. And that is a tree-based structure. That's a hierarchical taxonomy, which is great. But what a universal taxonomy gets you is you have the tree, and you basically cut the tree at some point. So you cut it here and you say 100 occupations, call it job family. You cut it there. You say 1,000 occupations, call it, occupation code or whatever you call it. Now that's a cut that applies to everyone. But if you're a very specific company, if you're NVIDIA and you're making, chips for something, you probably want to go really, really deep into hardware engineering right away. Like that's a majorly important job family for you. You don't want to go down to the very granular level to reach something that's important for you. And in the meantime, if you're NVIDIA, you don't care about the distinction between doctors and nurses and therapists. Like that's just not relevant for you. So you want to go deep into the parts of the tree that are relevant for your organization. You want to stay broad in parts that are not relevant. So instead of having a cut on the tree, you want this kind of ragged cut. You want to go deep here, stay broad there. And, if you're a different firm, you want a totally different cut. You want to stay broad in hardware. If you're a hospital, you want to stay broad in hardware engineering. You don't really care about the distinction between hardware engineers and software engineers and whatever. But you actually want to go really deep into the distinction between different types of doctors and different types of, physicians assistants and nurses and all that. So there's parts of the space that matter a lot for you as an idiosyncratic organization and parts that don't matter. So I think taxonomies should be adaptive, and I think there's no tension there. I think you should be able to, have a universal tree, but also a distinct slice of that tree. So I think we don't really need to sacrifice universality and specificity. But I think in the structure that ONET has, there is that sacrifice. And I think that's, a function of how they collect data, how they've constructed the taxonomy. And I think there's very little distinct usefulness in ONET right now. So I think that's, kind of becoming less relevant as technology evolves, as the labor market adapts. So that's a take there. I see more questions. Stephanie, Daphne,
Yeah,
Beverly.
yeah. Let me jump in here because
Sure,
I'm trying to kind of navigate logically here.
sure.
Daphne, and I think you did to a certain extent, but Daphne is asking if you could share an example of how specifically Revelio Labs steps in and helps organizations make their decisions around their taxonomies, skills, et cetera.
Yeah, great question. So one and this is really what I mentioned in the first part of the book. It's really getting the definitions right, getting to know like what you should be categorizing and how you should be thinking about the relationships between different facets of employment data. So I think there's three very relevant you know dimensions of employment that need categorizing. One is jobs, and jobs get clustered into occupations. That's the clearest one. It's one that we all understand. Another is skills. I'll get back to skills because that's something where I think there's a lot of misinformation and confusion about. But the next, and I think the most underrated, is tasks and activities. So so and organizations really don't have good taxonomies of tasks and activities, which is problematic. But it becomes really important to define a job as a bundle of activities. That's just definitionally what a job is. Importantly, jobs are not bundles of skills. And sometimes we see, some people in the space kind of get confused about that and think about, skills as the building blocks of jobs. But that's really a mistake because jobs, skills are not attributes of jobs, they're attributes of people. And skills are, importantly need to be considered as inputs into completing work activities. And I think that's especially important in the age of AI. And when we think about automation, it's important to note that AI, or really any technology for that matter, does not automate jobs wholesale and does not automate skills. It automates work activities. And if we think about a job as a bundle of work activities, we can reconfigure jobs to account for that automation, introduce new activities or specialize more. But some reconfiguration has to happen, which really involves a very well laid out structure of the tasks and activities within an occupation, and how to track that over time, how to track those changes over time. Skills are also, of course, important to track, but a job could change without the skills of the people doing those jobs changing at all. Like if there's new technology that comes out tomorrow and we're all able to do our jobs differently, skills don't change. Like we're all the same people we were a day ago. So that's just important to note that the skill mix that's required to complete new work activities does change, but the skills themselves don't change. Or I mean, they could change. That's why we have L&D groups and trainings and all that. So changing skills is an important part of workforce planning, but it needs to be factored in with a good understanding of work activities. So we need taxonomies of work activities, we need taxonomies of skills and taxonomies of occupations, and we need the crosswalks between all of those. We need to say for a given job, what's the mix of skills? For a given activity, what's the mix of skills? For a given, job, what's the mix of work activity? We need to have that kind of 3 by 3 set of crosswalks. Once we have that, then we can do workforce planning. Then we can say, okay, there's some change in the organization. Maybe it's technology, or maybe it has nothing to do with technology. Maybe it's a merger, or maybe it's some new business strategy, or maybe, there's a bunch of layoffs or whatever. Things happen to organizations all the time that affect the work they do, that affect the people that they need. So I'd say, the way we sometimes work with organizations is that we'll kind of come in and do like, an audit of their job architecture and say like where it's good, where it's bad, where it needs improvements. And then we'll, say like here's a custom job architecture where, we can get a sense for like what the mix of jobs are, of work activities, of skills, how to integrate that into systems, and most importantly, how to version it. So, unlike consulting firms that kind of want to come back every 2 to 3 years, um, I think the goal in a well-designed job architecture project is to adapt as the economy adapts, as the needs of the firm adapt. So, being able to deal with emergence and obsolescence is particularly important. So that's kind of how we would think about a well-designed job architecture project.
Yeah, I think it's very, I see a lot of validation here in the comments, but so relevant to all of this noise right now around skills, 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 skills based. But as you're saying, that is a very reductive and not particularly maybe even helpful way of looking at what needs to be done now, as you're saying, with creating agility, flexibility, catching emergence and also the speed of change, right?
Yeah.
So we definitely will. We're going to zero in on that part of your book to see how we can convey that new landscape of job activities overall. Fascinating. Speaking about AI, and I will get to a couple more questions here. So how do you see this this new technology and all of that talk influencing what the job market is going to be prioritizing? Because right now we talk about reskilling, but it often sounds like the same old, we're just going to get you from this skill to the next skill. But I see it as a fundamentally different way of looking at learning through in the job, in the flow of work, etc. So,
Yeah.
what is your take in this kind of job environment for people to stay relevant and not think about it? And for us as educators, also take a note of it. How do we develop that agility, fluidity, and adaptability without getting stuck in thinking about the next moment of stability in a sense with a new set of skills?
Yeah. Hugely important question. So one is that you asked for a take. So here's a maybe a spicy take that I think reskilling as an initiative I think has many more failures than successes. Reskilling is I think very rarely the right solution. And I'll tell you why. I mean, I worked on a reskilling project for 3 years at IBM, and I wish I had that part of my life back because I don't think it was terribly successful. And I think the issue with reskilling is that it very often involves a reallocation of people from different parts of the organization to other parts of the organization. And the reality is that, a manager at IBM is kind of indifferent about whether they lose someone to a different company or to a different group at IBM. So if there's a prescriptive recommendation that, oh, someone should be moved, someone should go into this training program and move from here to there. Organizations are political, and if someone doesn't want to lose that person, they will pull whatever strings they have and put up a fight. And that person won't get moved. I mean, that's just kind of how things work. And 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 they don't want to lose their best people. And if they are letting someone go, if they say, "Oh yeah, I'm fine with that," then maybe the receiving part of the organization thinks, "Well, not so fast. Maybe I don't want them, you know? So the market can kind of unravel in a way. Um, Very similar to is a famous paper by George Akerlof called "The Market for Lemons," and you know it unravels in a very similar way. You know, once the willingness to you know get rid of something, you know, conveys some negative signal about it, then you see the market unraveling, and I think we saw that in real time. I mean, very few people get reskilled through these reskilling programs. So, you know, it looks great on a deck. We say, yeah, you know, it's hard to train people and onboard people and hire, you know, it's very costly and, you know, we have what we need internally. Why don't we just reallocate and bada bing, bada boom, and we make $1 bajillion? You know, that's like, you know, we've all seen that use case laid out and I think they don't really account for the organizational friction that comes up. So, I mean, there are cases where there have been some successes where they deal with that well, but it's difficult. So I don't want to say it's always, you know, the it's always a mistake. But oh, thanks, Liz, for posting the paper. There's another paper that I wanna promote. The relevant to this question. It's called Adaptive Organizations. I forget the author, but I think one of them's at Columbia. But it's this idea that and I think it really is something that I think a lot about, you know, that's relevant to your question, that there are some organizations where work reconfigures very flexibly, and other organizations that are more procedural where it doesn't. So, and I think that's ultimately going to be the determinant to how work transforms in the age of AI and automation. So I'll tell you about my own organization. You know, we're only 70 people. You know, we're not certainly not the size of something like IBM, but but we're quite adaptive. I mean, things change all the time. You know, people's jobs are very, very fluid. You know, we'll have a client request and they say, "Oh, now we need to do a new thing." And, you know, what I do or what others in the organization do is they think, "Okay, who's got the bandwidth and the interest and skills to kind of take this on?" And that happens every day. Or, you know, someone, you know, maybe someone quits, or maybe, you know, someone says they're not interested in this work anymore, or, you know, we find out that the way that someone had been doing things is actually like not aligned with what they're really good at. These things happen all the time. You know, business priorities change very rapidly, and we are constantly reconfiguring what people do. And I think I'd go so far as to say that management, standing on one foot, management is about reconfiguring work. That is simply, you know, just what it is. You know, you have organizational needs that are fluid and changing, and you have people, you know, who you manage that have, you know, skills and interests and competencies and ambitions and all these traits. And, you know, those need to be matched. And, you know, they're both fluid. Both of those things are changing. So jobs, you know, the collection of tasks that people do need to be reconfigured all the time. And, you know, in my organization, we're constantly reconfiguring. And most of the time that has nothing to do with technology. It's just because businesses are dynamic. And, you know, technology, of course, is another thing that changes requirements, but that's just one thing of many things that could change work requirements. So I think, you know, we need to think about the best ways that companies can be adaptive. Now, I don't want to say that's necessarily the best approach for all organizations. There's a trade-off. You know, if you're more adaptive, it's kind of messy. And, you know, if you undertake a lot of process, there's an efficiency that happens there. So, you know, if you're on the proverbial assembly line, you know, someone on that step in the assembly line is very, very specialized in what they do. And that's the Taylorist style of work, where people become, you know, more and more and more efficient at very precise tasks. And that there's a time and a place for that, but that's becoming increasingly, you know, costly in an economy that is adapting. So, you know, I think procedural organizations are probably going to be the losers in tomorrow's economy, and the adaptive organizations are probably going to be the winners in tomorrow's economy because I think, you know, organizations need to optimize for adaptation. Now, there's different ways that happens. I think, you know, I touched upon this a little bit in this book, but would love to, you know, go deeper on it. That, you know, work reconfigures in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's a manager, sometimes it's top-down job design, and the manager says, you got to stop doing this and do more of this, and reallocate your workload. Sometimes it's individuals, sometimes it's employees, and that's really known as job crafting. So sometimes individuals say, I think I should be doing things differently, or I am more interested in this, or there's a new technology and I want to adapt it or whatever. And the manager is kind of in the middle of those things. There's usually some negotiation that happens between the manager and the managee. And there's some dynamic process which determines, how work actually manifests. So I think that process is so interesting and really something that I think we need to understand better, as we think more about how work will transform.
Yeah, there was a lot of validation here. Edie Goldberg wrote about it and looking at the startup companies, et cetera, where these adaptive models have been perfected in a sense, but still the majority of our organizations are procedural. And that's why I think they are leaning into these skills, because it seems like if you adopt the skills approach, it is a top-down procedural thing, and you can bring the agents and displace management, whereas the adaptive organization actually leans into the management role as the orchestrator of all of these tasks in an as-needed basis. And this is amazing. And Ben, the final kind of send-off comment from you, since we have a lot of students here in this, we are hopefully going to be looking at your book in all of our classes. What's going to happen to resumes? How do we reflect
Yeah.
people's readiness for this economy of adaptive organizations, other than listing, skills that right now is sort of the protocol of how you structure your resume?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the short answer is I don't really know. I mean, there's a lot of experimentation going on. Maybe there's like video interviews and stuff like that, and yeah, I mean, I think with AI right now, there's some kind of doom and gloom that we're just going to be flooded with a bunch of garbage and like be kind of in the dark. There's also more of an optimistic take that we, can introduce more nuance into resumes, because the ability to kind of parse and read those is getting better and better. Um, I think yeah, I kind of can be sold on either. I think on the more optimistic side, I think there's we have the ability to introduce actual work activities and align, and those could get categorized now that we have taxonomies of work activities like that, those can be processed by machines pretty well. Um, even universities. I mean, sometimes I'm was born and raised in America, and I know American universities pretty well. But when I get a resume from someone who did their training overseas, I don't really know what to make of their universities. I don't really know their creds from, Turkey or wherever. I mean, they just have different, there's just different knowledge, and like one person can't really be an expert on all those things. But I think we can get better at that through reading them through machines. So I think there is the ability to introduce more nuance if we ever get to, video-based interviews. There's a lot that we can pick up on. We can maybe get to, preferences around what work styles are better or worse. So I think that's exciting. But on the negative side, it is possible to just generate misleading resumes, or whatever the resume turns out to be. It can be, it's easier and easier to misrepresent yourself. So I think there will have to be some more advances in like how we kind of check those after the fact. I actually think LinkedIn is wonderful for creating like a single source of truth, so that with LinkedIn nobody makes, 1,000 different resumes for 1,000 different jobs they apply to. They have one source of truth, which I think is great. Um, Maybe there can be something like that for a more like multidimensional resume. But yeah, I mean, can only speculate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are at the end of the hour. I know we have very busy people here. Thank you, Ben. We will be looking to your books coming out and hope to have you back. And here's a agenda for our as we're planning our next semester. Please take into account these dates and stay tuned. And again, we often get a question about are these presentations? They're all going to be posted on our YouTube channel, as well as everyone registered will get a recording of this in your mailbox. And at this point, Ben, thank you so much. It's always so mind expanding to chat with you and bring you back here to our NYU community. Many thanks. Stay tuned. And I want to wish everyone really good holiday season. And we'll see you next year, 2026. Thank you.
Thank you.